Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to our conversation this evening on race, wrongful conviction, and the death penalty. My name is Jonathan Stewart. I'm going to be facilitating our panel discussion tonight. I'm a recent transplant to Chattanooga. I moved here from Jackson, Tennessee about 4 months ago. I'm an attorney here in Chattanooga with the law firm of Rainey Kaiser, Revere, and Bell. I also serve on the board of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, which is our sponsor for this evening's event. TADP, as we lovingly refer to it, is a statewide organization whose mission is to honor life in Tennessee by working to end the death penalty. And we're grateful to all of you for joining us tonight. As you're aware, this conversation is set up in a Zoom webinar format, which means that you can't verbally ask questions. But we hope that you're going to ask questions using our chat feature, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can tonight. Excuse me, just by way of a little bit of background, I'm a conservative, and I came to my position on the death penalty through my wallet when I learned how expensive it is, and through that, my faith ultimately followed as I started to study about the death penalty. So all are welcome. I do want to take just a moment and thank Stacy and our panelists for being here, for taking the time to do this tonight. And I want to introduce them, and I'm going to have to read some of it, and I apologize. I know that's not the maybe the most professional, but so that you get all the accurate and pertinent information, I think it's important. And I have a neurotic dog sitting right under my feet, and if he barks, I apologize. But there's not much I can do about it. If I don't have him in the room with me, he's going to be barking anyway. So we'll get moving. First, I want to introduce Sabrina Butler-Smith, who was a Mississippi teenager when she was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to die for the death of her infant son, Walter. She endured 5 years in prison. 33 months of those were on death row. Sabrina lives in Memphis and previously served on the board of Witness to Innocence, which is an organization of, by, and for death row exonerees, empowering them to use their own voices to fight for the end of the death penalty in the United States. I've had the pleasure of hearing Sabrina talk a number of times, and you're in for a treat. For the past 20 years, our next panelist, Rolanda Holman, has passionately worked to free her brother, Pervis Payne, and to share her deep conviction about her brother's innocence. Pervis was convicted and sentenced to death in Shelby County in 1988 and has served over 30 years on Tennessee's death row. And I'm sure through national media, many of you have heard about Pervis's case. He was granted reprieve by Governor Bill Lee last year that stopped his December 3 execution date. That ended April 9th, which has opened the door to our Tennessee Supreme Court to start setting new execution dates again. Just this week, our legislature, the General Assembly, overwhelmingly passed legislation that would update the definition of intellectual disability in the state criminal code and allow a few individuals that are already on death row, like Pervis, an opportunity to have their intellectual disability claims fully considered by the courts. Governor Lee has said that he plans to sign this legislation, which is wonderful news for allowing Pervis back in court for his intellectual disability to finally be considered. But there's still a great deal of work that we have to do to ensure that he's freed from death row. His sister Rolanda has been crucial in raising awareness about the injustices of her brother's case locally, nationally, and internationally, and is committed to getting him home. Kelley Henry is the Supervisory Assistant Federal Public Defender of the Federal Public Defender's Office of Middle Tennessee. She's represented those sentenced to death for 2 decades. She currently represents Pervis Payne, as well as many others on Tennessee's death row. Most recently, Kelley served as counsel for Lisa Montgomery, who was executed by the federal government in January of 2021, despite overwhelming evidence of Ms. Montgomery's severe mental illness. The American Bar Association has recognized Kelley's outstanding work in 2019, giving her the John Paul Stevens Guiding Hand of Counsel Award. Finally, the Reverend Stacy Rector is as the director of Tennessee Alternatives for the Death Penalty. an organization, as I mentioned, whose goal is to honor life by abolishing the death penalty. Um, TDP seeks to achieve its mission through education, organization, and advocacy. Reverend Rector has led TDP since 2006 and has worked on death penalty repeal for the past 25 years. And I can personally attest, as a dear friend, she is a rock star, and it has been an amazing asset in the work that we're doing as an organization and across the state in trying to end the death penalty. So I want to say thank you again for all of you being with us this evening. To start things off, we're going to hear from Sabrina Butler-Smith. And Sabrina, if you would get us rolling, please.
Thank you so much, John. I'm happy to be here, and we got such a wonderful panel, and I'm glad to be on it again with you, Rolanda and Miss Stacy and Miss Kelley. You guys are awesome, and I just really want to do all I can to help Pervis and to bring him home, because he deserves that. My name is Sabrina Butler-Smith, and in 1989, I was accused of killing my son. I lived in a small town called Columbus, Mississippi, and at the time I was only 17 years old and had been there since I was 14 years old, alone. I had two boys, actually. My oldest son was at his grandparents' house at the time. I lived in the apartment complex where I stayed. I had been over there for a little while, and most of the people, well, no one knew, actually. I didn't have a car or a phone at that time. This was in 89, but I used to like to jog back then. So I made the mistake of leaving my son at the house once I put him to sleep, and I jogged to the end of the street and went back to the house. And when I did go back, I kind of knew what time he would wake up. So I went in the kitchen first. And when I went in the kitchen, I went to his bedroom, and I noticed something was wrong right off the bat. I saw he wasn't breathing. So I panicked, and I grabbed him and I ran outside, and this was late. It was like 11, almost 12 o'clock. So when I got him, I started screaming and hollering for anybody, just anybody to hear me. And the lady next door to me, she did open her door, but she said that her kids was in bed and she didn't have time. So she closed the door in my face. So I had to run downstairs. And when I ran downstairs, I don't know who doors I was beating on. I was just beating on doors and asking for, trying to get somebody help. And the lady from the end apartment came out, grabbed my son. She took him in the apartment and put him on the floor, and she started CPR. I ran back out and I tried to get, anybody that would, help me to get him to the hospital. And this couple offered 3 doors down to take me. So I ran back in the house and I grabbed him, and she told me to blow in his mouth, hold his nose, and press in his stomach. Later on, I would find out that I applied adult CPR to a 9-month-old all the way to the hospital. But I didn't know. I just was trying to save my son. That's all I had in my mind at the time, was just to get him to breathe. So when I got to the hospital, I started thinking, how kids would think. When you get in trouble, the first thing some kids do is tell the story. And that's what I did. When they started asking me questions, what happened, I just started coming up with all different types of scenarios as to what happened to my son. After they told me that they couldn't save him, that they tried everything they could. And then they told me to go to the police station. So I went to the police station that night. And when I went there, I still didn't tell the truth. So they told me to go home, and I went home, and I couldn't wait for the sun to get up. I was trying to figure out what had happened to him. And, it seemed like the sun just came right up. And so I found a way back to the hospital, because I thought, they would tell me, but I didn't know that they had to do an autopsy report to tell me, exactly what the cause of death was. So when I got there, the detectives were there, and they said, I got to take you back down for more questioning. So they put me in the back of the police car, and they took me to the police station. When I got there, I'm, not knowing really what's going on. Before I could sit down in the seat, they started yelling, screaming. They got in my face, and they were saying, you beat him, you stomped him, this is what you did. You didn't tell the truth, and this and that. So that went on for like 4 hours. I had 4 hours of interrogation, and I gave up. When he wrote the statement, He pushed it in my face and he said, sign this. And a lot of people say, well, why would you sign something that you know you didn't do? Well, you have to be interrogated to understand exactly what they do to you when you're being interrogated by law enforcement, especially when you're a child. Because at the time, they read me my rights. I thought right to remain silent meant quiet until spoken to. That's not what it means. But I learned that growing up. So they charged me then with capital murder in the course of child abuse. They charged me with a child abuse charge that wasn't even a law until 23 days after they locked me up. So they sent me to the county jail. When I went to the county jail, I was trying to figure out what had happened. And I was so upset because, I never knew what my son died from. I sat in the county jail a whole year before I even saw my attorneys. 2 days before trial is when I saw them. They came, they didn't give me no preparation. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. The only thing I was told to do was to sit and look at the jury. I was trying to ask, could I take the stand in my own defense? They wouldn't let me do that. They said that they had it nipped in the bud, and the second chair in my defense team was a divorce attorney. I found out later on, and he was drunk during the whole trial. They never called not one witness in my case, not even the girl that did the CPR. I looked around me and saw she was sitting in the back of the courtroom the whole trial. I looked at the jury pool. Nobody looked like me except for two people. It was supposed to have been two people. One was an alternate and the other was one. Most everybody on the jury was white. So I knew going in that I was doomed. I just, you have that feeling when something is not going right, and it most definitely wasn't going right. I was found guilty March the 13th of 1990, and they sentenced me to die July the 2nd of 1990. And when I finally made it to death row, I was 19 years old. Going to death row was one of the worst experiences, on top of losing my son, on top of knowing that I'm innocent all in one. It's hell, it's torture. I mean, they took my life from me for nothing. I sat on death row 2 years, 9 months, still not knowing what my son died from. Out of all this time, nobody told me when my death date came that the state had to exhaust all state remedies before they could actually carry out a death sentence. So July the 2nd, and I always get kind of upset because I feel like it's sad that I have to explain exactly a mistake that our judicial system is supposed to protect us from. It doesn't make sense that I have to, they almost killed me. I'm here by the grace of God, in spite of the system. But July the 2nd was one of the worst days of my life. I took the stand to go to the door. I paced the floors. I listened for every chain, every sound, because I thought that that was actually my death date, to die. I used to think, how when you're a kid, you watch the stories where the guy's walking down this long hall with the old ball and chain, and he's getting ready to die, and there's a preacher on one side. That's what I thought. I had no clue of what the death penalty was really about. The only way I knew was from another inmate talking to me at the time that I had befriended, and she was telling me that they couldn't do anything because I hadn't been back to court. But you don't believe what's being said until the date actually passed. It did. My sentence was overturned in 92. I ended up with two more attorneys who came in and proved my case, found out my son had heart problems, kidney problems, and chronic bowel syndrome. It was nothing that I had done to cause his death, not nothing. Today, I have an 18-year-old daughter that has the same disease. And the only thing I have to say is that I think that it's wrong that this death penalty still exists, because there's people like Pervis Payne who is sitting there innocent, and he shouldn't have to fight for his life. When you make a mistake, you need to fess up and let the world know this is a mistake that you made. It doesn't make sense for us to have to get on national TV run away. I put myself on death row. Hey, I want to go to death row today. Nobody, and it's certainly racism should not play a part in what's happening now. It doesn't make sense to me. But I do this because I know this is what God wants me to do. And I'm going to keep doing it until I can't do it anymore. It is my duty and my honor to work with you guys, to speak with anybody that will listen. And that's my story.
Thank you, Sabrina. I really appreciate that. Stacy, I think you're next up. If you would tell us a little bit more about the death penalty, please.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for, again, having us. Thanks to the other panelists and John, who are sharing with you this evening. And I want to just tell you a little bit more about why we at Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty believe that the death penalty is a failed policy that must be repealed. When the color of your skin, the amount of money you have in your bank account, when your mental health status, or the county in which you live has an outsized impact on whether or not you receive a death sentence, the system has a very serious problem. Half of Tennessee's current death row comes from one single county, Shelby County. Historically, Shelby County, and that's, as you all know, where Memphis is also among the 25 counties in our country with the most recorded lynchings between 1877 and 1950. It's the county where journalist and activist Ida B. Wells wrote an expose about an 1892 lynching that so enraged locals there that they drove her from her home, and she ended up relocating in Chicago. It's also the county which sent Pervis Payne to death row. And all of these facts are not coincidental. In our state, African Americans make up 17% of the state's total population and 50% of our current death row. Between 2007 and 2017, 8 of the 9 new death sentences handed down in Tennessee were given to Black defendants. And across this country, 75% of cases resulting in executions were for the murders of white people, though only about half of all murder victims are white. There was a 2012 report from Equal Justice Initiative, and some of you may know Brian Stevenson's name of Just Mercy. This is his organization, and this group researched jury selection procedures in 8 southern states, including ours, and they uncovered shocking evidence of racial discrimination in every state in the jury selection process, including counties where prosecutors excluded nearly 80% of African Americans who were qualified for jury service, majority Black counties where defendants were tried by all white juries, and some prosecutors who were actually trained to exclude people from jury service based on their race, and trained on how to conceal the bias. This kind of racial bias was evident in 1987 in the trial of Abu Ali Abdur Rahman here in Nashville, when the prosecutor struck qualified Black jurors from jury service based on their race, among other forms of prosecutorial misconduct. Last year, the Death Penalty Information Center released a report entitled Enduring Injustice, the Persistence of Racial Bias in the U.S. Death Penalty. And you can find this report on DPIC, Death Penalty Information Center's website, deathpenaltyinfo.org. I think that'll pop up in the chat here in a minute. And that report notes the implicit bias and the overt racism that continue to influence the use of our nation's death penalty. The death penalty system is also very costly in terms of financial costs, costing millions more per case than the alternative sentences, but also costly in terms of human cost, given the traumatic toll that it takes on so many people, on the families of murder victims, on the families of those on death row, all of whom are trapped in a decades-long process. Correctional staff who are asked to carry out executions as part of their employment. Jurors who may discover years later they didn't have all the facts that they needed, or that there are sentences available today that weren't available to them. Attorneys like Kelley Henry, who worked for years and years to represent these men and women, doing everything in their power to save their lives. Then there's, of course, the issue of accuracy. To date, 185 people have been wrongfully convicted, sentenced to death, and then exonerated in our country since 1973. That data show that for every 8 people who have been executed in that time period, 1 person has been wrongfully convicted, sentenced to death, and exonerated. Those are very troubling numbers. A finding in a study that also was recently released by DPIC called the Innocence Epidemic was that of this 185 number, 185 people who have been exonerated in that time frame, 69% have included official misconduct by police, prosecutors, or other government officials in their wrongful convictions. Official misconduct was much more likely in cases involving defendants of color, in cases which exonerations took 2 decades or more, and in cases in which DNA evidence played a significant role in proving innocence. All of these factors are in play in the case of Pervis Payne. I've told you now what's wrong with the death penalty system, and I could keep going, but I will stop so that we can talk for a minute about the progress that we are making as more and more of us become educated and activated on this issue. Recent Gallup polling shows that support for the death penalty in this country is at its lowest level in 40 years. And when given alternatives, 60% of Americans now support those alternative sentences over the death penalty. Here in Tennessee, juries have delivered only 2 new death sentences since 2013, showing that Tennesseans are moving away from this practice, though this has not translated to our states moving away from executions as we continue to execute individuals who have been on our death row for decades. Virginia, just a month or so ago, a historically very active death penalty state, became the 23rd state to repeal the death penalty and the first Southern state to do so. And if you include states where the death penalty has been repealed, where there are formal moratoria on the death penalty, or where it hasn't been used in a decade or more, we're now up to 34 states, which either in law or in practice have ended the death penalty. Right now, Ohio, another historically active death penalty state, has a viable repeal bill moving through its legislature. So does Nevada. And as John mentioned earlier, just on Monday, here in Tennessee, our General Assembly overwhelmingly supported a bill to prevent the execution of those with intellectual disability in our state. These are all very positive signs that the trends are moving in the right direction, but there is still so much work for us to do. And toward the end of our time together, you'll be provided with some actions that you can take that are going to keep helping us move forward. So in closing, I think we just must ask ourselves the question, what are the reasons that we maintain the death penalty? Why do we continue to hold on to it? Does it make us any safer? Does it help prevent future crime? Does anyone gain better access to mental or behavioral health care because of the death penalty? Does the death penalty offer any avenues for more and better intervention in the lives of children who are exposed to abuse and trauma, as so many of the individuals on death row were? Is an execution the very best we can do to support surviving murder victims' families and their communities, to assist them in their healing? Does the death penalty model respect for the dignity of human life? Other states have asked these questions and have concluded the answer is no. The death penalty doesn't serve us. It doesn't make us safer. It's unfairly applied. It gets it wrong. It costs us dearly, both in financial and human cost. The death penalty system diminishes all of us, and it must end, and together we can end it. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. Kelley, if you would share a little bit with us on your work as a capital defender, please.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Sabrina, for your testimony. I'm so sorry that that happened to you, and I'm sorry on behalf of every lawyer that you did not receive the representation you deserve. Thank you, Stacy, for asking me to be a part of this panel. And of course, I'm always thrilled to present along with the amazing Rolanda Holman, Pervis's sister. I want to be respectful of your time, and so I'm going to focus my remarks on the case that is closest to my heart right now, and that is the case of Pervis Payne. I am Kelley Henry, and I am the supervisor of the Capital Habeas Unit, which is located in Nashville, Tennessee. We have 2 capital habeas units in Tennessee, one in Knoxville and mine in Nashville. The Nashville CHU, as we're called, represents men who are on death row in the Middle District and Western District of Tennessee. So that puts Shelby County within my jurisdiction, and they make up the majority of our caseload. My clients come to us when they have exhausted all of their state court appeals. So they've been through state direct appeal and state post-conviction. Then they come to federal court. Our attorneys get appointed and they stay with us for better or worse through the conclusion of their case. So we have walked clients out of prison, and we have said goodbye to clients who've been executed, and everything in between that you might imagine. Pervis was not on my original caseload. I've known Pervis since I moved to Tennessee in 2000, and would see him at the VG in Unit 2 when I would come to visit my other clients, and he was always polite and respectful, and I always said hi, and thought he was a great guy, but I didn't know anything about his case. Then his longtime attorneys, who were very bright men, left the office in 2019. And at that point, I knew that Pervis was looking at a very serious execution date. He had lived through 2 other serious execution dates that had been stayed at the last minute. And I knew that Tennessee was, fixing to execute a lot of people. And in fact, they requested execution dates for 10 Tennesseans on death row on September the 20th of 2019. And that included Pervis as well as 6 other clients of my office. So I took his case. And I took his case and did what I do with all my cases when they're new to me, is I approach it like I was their trial attorney, because I used to be a trial attorney, and that's really where my training started. So I will take the police reports and read them. And I presume when I look at a police report or a transcript that there's inconsistencies, that there's going to be lies, quite frankly, missing evidence. But in Pervis's case, it was so patently clear from the beginning that he was innocent. When I look at his case, I saw red flag after red flag that this was a case where an African-American child, he was only 20 years old. I have a 20-year-old, that's a child. Tried to do the right thing, tried to help, and got arrested. So for those of you who don't know a lot about the crime in Pervis's case, let me just give you a short version of what happened. On June 27th of 1987, Sharice Christopher and her 2 children were brutally stabbed multiple times by someone in her apartment. Sharice Christopher and her daughter Lacey died. Her son Nicholas, thankfully, was able to survive the stabbing. This was a horrific crime scene. Pervis was hanging out with friends that day. It was a beautiful summer day. He and his cousin Sylvester Robinson had been playing cards with a friend earlier that day. They rode around, they went to a church picnic, and Pervis had plans to be with his girlfriend, Bobby Thomas, for the weekend. So he had packed an overnight bag and was getting ready to go hang out with her for the weekend. Sylvester was driving him that day because that particular day, Pervis's dad had said he couldn't have the car. Sylvester believed that Bobby was home. And so he dropped Pervis off at the apartment building to run home and mow his yard. And then he would be back later that evening, and they were going to, play some cards and hang out, as kids do. To this day, Sylvester regrets that he dropped Pervis off. He told me and my investigator and later the governor's legal counsel about how Pervis had said, hey, I'll go cut the lawn with you and we'll get it done quicker. And he's like, no, man, it's okay. You go on and I'll be back soon. The next time Sylvester saw Pervis, he was in jail for Sharice Christopher's murder. Pervis went, first knocked on the door and Bobby wasn't home. This is 1987. There weren't cell phones. So he just left his stuff and started walking around in the neighborhood. He was familiar with the neighborhood. He'd been there several times. He ran into some women who were out sunbathing, asked for a drink of water. They gave him a drink of water. He wasn't acting strange at all. He went back upstairs to check and see if maybe Bobby was home. And when he did, he heard muffled sounds coming from the apartment across the way. This is a very short landing. He, of course, had seen the Christopher family, but didn't know them. But he could hear the baby crying. And when he says baby, he heard Nicholas Christopher crying. Nicholas was just shy of 4 years old. He went in, he knocked on the door and said, hey, coming in. And what he saw would cause all of us to freeze and to freak out. And then he did, his instincts took over and he did what his dad taught him to do, which was to help. Sharice Christopher was still alive and the knife was in her neck. Pervis went to remove the knife from her neck. And she grabbed onto him and he said, it's going to be okay. I'm going to help. And as he removed the knife, he got a few nicks on his hand. And we have pictures of them and they're literally nicks. They're not cuts. He tried to call, but he couldn't remember the number to call. He dialed 411 instead of 911. In the old days, if any of you might remember, 411 was the number you called to get information. It was directory assistance. Pervis's fingerprints are on the phone, which substantiates his testimony that he was trying to call for help. There are no traces of blood on that phone. If he had stabbed Sharice Christopher, there would be blood on that phone. Then he got really scared. He saw the police arrive. And he knew when he saw that white police officer get out of the car that they were going to think that he did this. He was the only one standing there in this white woman's apartment with all of this blood and these three people he thought all dead or dying. So he did what many would do, and he ran. He ran because he was scared. He was found within an hour and a half. He surrendered easily. There's some myth out there about how he was hiding in the attic with a knife. That's not true. But he came down and went into custody. For 33 years, almost 34, Pervis has always maintained he was only there to help. When I looked at the evidence, it didn't add up. For one thing, the police didn't process the crime scene correctly. They claim that they didn't own a color camera and that when they borrowed their chief's camera and took it to be developed, they realized they hadn't put film in the camera. That's just not believable, particularly anyone who knows what a camera was like in the 1980s. You had to know how many exposures you had left, and there was a little thing at the top that told you. You would have to advance the frame to get to the next negative. So that testimony didn't make sense. They didn't preserve photographs of Pervis that would have shown that he had no needle marks on his arm. They would later claim that he was addicted to drugs. The problem with that is that he didn't use drugs. There was no evidence that he used drugs. And his family members attest to this day that he never did use drugs. So that made no sense. They tried to claim that he had a piece of paper in his pocket that tested positive for traces of cocaine. Except that piece of paper wasn't tested until 2 weeks before trial, when the prosecutors knew they didn't have a motive. And then somehow in those 2 weeks between the testing and the trial, that piece of paper went missing. There's no photograph of it. There's no chain of custody. And that becomes a theme over and over with the evidence in this case. One person said the paper was blue. Another person said the paper was white. They only said there were traces of cocaine. Yet on the night that he was arrested, Pervis's mother went to the police station and begged the police to test her son for drugs. She knew he didn't do this. She knew he couldn't do this. And she wanted to preserve that evidence of his innocence, and yet they refused. That's a huge red flag to any of us, but certainly to a defense attorney who knows that if the police think that a person's on drugs, they're going to do whatever they can to preserve that testimony. They're going to take blood, urine, and hair. They did none of those things in this case. They tried to imply that Pervis was an IV drug user, despite the fact that there were no track marks. And their evidence of that was a syringe cap that one officer claimed he had removed out of Pervis's pocket. Except the photos that do exist from the crime scene clearly show that the syringe cap was found on the floor of a room in the house where Pervis was arrested, which was not his home and it was not his room. And there's no evidence that syringe cap was ever in his possession. Could very easily have been from someone who had, diabetes and had to take insulin. The victim, on the other hand, did have evidence of methamphetamine in her system. Another red flag for me is that the testimony of the officers is that they staged the photographs at the crime scene. The victims are described as either being face up or one face up and one face down, but that we do know that an officer said that they took a hat off of the little girl's arm, a hat that they said belonged to Pervis, and then placed her body on top of the hat after it had been taken off her arm. That's just not credible. That's not police procedure. If you remove an item of evidence, it should be immediately tagged and bagged to prevent any other forensic evidence from being accidentally put on that piece of evidence. They staged a photograph in order to make Pervis look guilty. Clear and simple. And in fact, even in the DA's files, when we went and looked through them, we saw in the DA's own handwriting a question in his own mind as to whether or not some of the evidence in this case had been planted. After I got on the case, we asked the Innocence Project to become involved, and they agreed to take the case. Barry Scheck and Vanessa Potkin, who had also been involved in the Sibley Alley case several years earlier, another Shelby County, another Millington, Tennessee case where I believe an innocent man was executed. Vanessa and Barry took the case and worked with me to ask for DNA. And the Shelby County DA opposed, which should raise all sorts of red flags for folks. Why would a DA oppose DNA testing? If you're so sure you have the guilty guy, DNA is only going to help your case get better. It's not going to make it worse. Yet we had to fight the DA. And in that process of fighting the DA, we met this amazing attorney named Kelley Harris, who is working with the National Bar Association in Memphis. And Kelley opened all sorts of doors for us in Memphis that had previously been closed. And we were able to put together a coalition of more than 150 organizations across the state of Tennessee, as well as numerous grassroots supporters that has grown to now over 730,000 signatures on the petition to save Pervis Payne. And we held a press conference in Memphis in August of 2020, where I believe it was Bishop Dillard said very clearly and very plainly to Amy Wyrick, you can listen to us now or you can listen to us later at the ballot box. She still opposed DNA. And 1 week later, when we went into court, evidence of the victim's fingernail scrapings that the state had said existed just 6 weeks earlier went missing. They vanished. There's no report, no photograph, no chain of custody. This DA has never been held to account for what happened in those 6 weeks where the most significant evidence of DNA disappeared. That in and of itself should raise the red flags of innocence for all of us. We did get DNA testing and it came back in January and it showed that Pervis's DNA was not on the handle of the murder weapon. As I said, this was a brutal crime scene. This victim was stabbed over 80 times. The children were stabbed multiple times. common sense tells you if Pervis was the person who committed these crimes, his DNA would be on the handle of that knife, and yet it was not. There was unidentified DNA on the handle of the knife, but unfortunately there are only 2 markers because it is so degraded. And the FBI database requires at least 10 in order to put it in the database to get a cold hit. If we had the fingernail scrapings, we could compare the 2 markers with the DNA that was under the victim's fingernails. And yet, here we are today without that proof. The other red flags that I had in this case involve the fact that Pervis is intellectually disabled. That had been the focus of the lawyers in my office for the past decade of Pervis's case. They didn't recognize the evidence of innocence. They didn't have a trial background. But they did know that he was intellectually disabled, and they tried for 10 years to get him into court, even causing the Tennessee Supreme Court to say in 2016 in his case that the legislature should pass a law to make a procedural avenue available for Pervis, which finally did occur Monday of this week, and for which we are so grateful to everyone. Certainly Senator Gardenhire and Representative Hawk, who sponsored the bill, the Tennessee Disability Coalition, who brought the bill to Senator Gardenhire and Representative Hawk, everyone who worked with them on behalf of the bill. And of course, we are deeply, deeply indebted to the Tennessee Black Caucus for State Legislators and Representative G.A. Hardaway, who were the first individuals to bring legislation to modernize Tennessee's death penalty law and to provide this procedural avenue. But even though this is a great victory, Pervis is not safe. Pervis remains on death row. And I'll close my remarks because I think it will be a good transition to Rolanda to say that the last red flag I have, and the thing that convinces me the most about why I know that Pervis Payne is innocent, is because I know his character and I know his family. You see, I typically represent people who have done some really bad things, and I love them, and I know that they're more than the worst thing they ever did. And I get into the sociology and anthropology of, what makes people end up in a situation where they could be my client. None of those things exist in Pervis's background because he didn't do this. He is innocent. There's no history of trauma, child abuse, severe mental illness. No, this is a history of a family that is loving, loyal, and steadfast and true to Pervis. This is a family where the mom and dad stayed married and within the home. A family of 2 sisters and an older brother who loved each other deeply. A family that has a faith in God that is unshakable even to this day. Pervis had never been arrested before, ever. He had no history of violence, no history of substance abuse. And since his arrest, his record has been pristine. A person does not just one day butcher a family to death and then show no sign of violence or mental illness on any day thereafter. That just does not happen. Pervis Payne is innocent, and we need to continue our momentum and not feel like, well, this law has passed, so he's safe now. He's not safe now. He's not. He remains convicted. He remains on death row until such time as we can have him adjudicated, not intellectually disabled and ineligible for the death penalty, and until such time we can convince Governor Lee to commute his sentence and release him from death row so that he can go home to his family, including the wonderful Rolanda Holman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelley. Rolanda, if you would, that was a great transition. Rolanda, if you would tell us a little bit about Pervis as a brother, and also how his death sentence has impacted your family, if you would.
Well, thank you so much, John and Kelley. I tell you, you definitely got me going. I hope you all can hear me well. It's always a privilege and an honor to be able to speak on behalf of my brother. I often say that I am his voice. Always get excited to share this panel with you, Sabrina. I'm still just never get tired of hearing your story. Never get tired. So thank you so much, Stacy, also for allowing this panel. And one thing about it is that it's a race and wrongful conviction. It plays a huge part in why we're here. And unfortunately, I would love not to be here to talk about race issues and in the criminal justice system or even any wrongful convictions. I would rather not do that because I just think that justice is something when everybody should do right. But unfortunately, there has been some injustices that have happened that has caused us to be able to, unfortunately, have these experiences, to be able to have to talk about it and fight for justice. I didn't realize justice was so hard to fight for. I look at the days of Dr. Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Rosa Parks, and it just didn't seem like, that it was just an easy thing. Yeah, they may have gotten a little fire hose against them, but I didn't think it was just so hard to fight until I got in the fight. And when I got in the fight, I realized that, it is something that is definitely worth fighting for. And Sabrina, like yourself, when you fight for your freedom as you have, you fought for Pervis as well. And when I fight for Pervis, I fight for those who are looking for an opportunity like him. So a little bit about my brother. He's just a wonderful man. I think Kelley has already told you, he's the same person that I knew when I grew up with him. I was always at his hip. I called him Bubba for the past, I'm 46 now. So since I was 2, so for 44 years, I've called him Bubba. And I still call him Bubba to this day. I am just learning to call him Pervis throughout all of this because I'm always calling him Bubba until it sounds so weird for me to say Pervis. So I'm learning as a 46-year-old adult to say Pervis now. So, but I love my brother. And I love my brother because I know his character. So let me take a little moment to tell you a little bit about my family. So a person asked me the other day, and you all bear with me because I have to tell, I feel like I'm compelled tonight to tell this story. Okay, so bear with me. I may go over my 10 minutes, Stacy, but I want you all to bear with me for just a moment because I want to tell you something about my family. And as Kelley was saying, yes, my father's a pastor. He still pastors. My mom and dad, they brought us up in the church. And not all, they say PK kids are bad. Sabrina, you may have heard that, in the Black community, they say all PK kids are bad. But I tell you what, we may have been bad, but one thing about it is that we had fun while we did our little things, what we were doing. But one thing that's certain is that they didn't raise any killers. That's the certain thing about it. So we weren't that kind of bad, but we were those kids that we liked to dance or they didn't want us to listen to the secular music. We did those things, and we were at each other. We had our little brother sister arguments and things, and then we make up, like regular kids do. So when we brought up, there was never a time that my parents always taught us to be respectable, to be helpful. And what happened is Bubba was the one who would drive the members back and forth home. He would pick them up, take them to the church and things. So he was always a person who liked to help. A friend of mine asked me the other day, she asked me this question that really moved me, but she didn't know that I had already addressed this concern. She said, Ro, how do you tell your boys about helping people now? And there was a post that someone made on Twitter. I think it was maybe the Nashville scene. It was talking about helping. And I retweeted it and I said, when does helping convict you for a crime? When does that become a crime? And so I began to think about what birthed that in us. How is it innate in us to be able to help? And Stacy, when I first talked to you in 2019, I shared this story with you. And so it's a little story about my mother. When my sister and I, we were growing up, there was a lady who walked the street all the time. I'm going to call her Ann just for protection purposes. So Ann would walk the street all the time. And Ann, during this day and time, we would consider her schizophrenic and bipolar. And Ann didn't smell very well. So us as little children, we would say, Mom, please don't pick her up. She stinks. She stinks. And my mother would say, don't you guys be like that. That's not the way of the Lord. She always teaching us the way of the Lord. Don't be like that. That's not nice. We have to be kind to people. So mother picked Ann up and take her to Millington every time on our way to Millington. So there were times when we would ride to Millington and we didn't see Ann. We were so happy that Ann wasn't around because we didn't want Ann in the car. So one day we picked up Ann and mother said, Ann, would you like to come home with me would you spend the weekend with us one day? And Ann said, yes, ma'am. And we were thought, mother's lost her mind. Surely she's not going to let Ann come in this house. Surely she's not going to do this. So a couple of weeks later, we ran into Ann walking. Mother picked Ann up, took Ann to the house, and mother ran Ann's bath water. And mother told Ann, she said, Ann, I never forget this. She said, make sure you wash well. Ann did what she told her to do. Ann came out. Mother gave Ann clothes. Ann was much shorter than mother. So I knew mother had to have planned this because those clothes fit Ann to a T. Then after Ann got out, mother washed Ann's hair. And as she washed her hair, she said, Ann, you have beautiful hair. And she began to, I saw her praying over her as she was washing her hair. And then when we got ready to eat, we only had a few in the Black community. When we were growing up, we only had a few pieces of china. So that was only came out when my grandmother and them would come in from Chicago. We didn't eat on those plates all the time. But my mother made my sister and I serve her. So we had to serve her her plate. We had to serve her her glass. Now, she doesn't get a plastic cup. She said, no, you all get a plastic cup. We're going to give her the glass. And so we were so afraid because we didn't know what Ann was going to do while we were asleep because Ann had some mental problems. And my mother said, our house is a house of peace. She said, Ann is going to be fine. The next morning, Ann, we got up, mother said, Ann, she fixed the breakfast. She said, we had to serve her again on those same pieces of china that we had. And she said, Ann, how did you sleep? And she said, Bernice, that's the best sleep I've ever had in my entire life. So that's how helps started and to be planted into my sister and me and into my brother. We don't know anything else to do other than help. So I'm going to tell you, moving up to this day and time, 2020, we have a neighbor, someone who lives in our neighborhood, who is now a widow. And she stopped me one day and she said, you have the most wonderful sons. And I said, well, thank you. I think she said, they're so respectable. I said, well, thank you. And she said, one of them came to my house. And she said, and he said, you know, whatever you want me to do, I just want to be a help to you. If you want me to take your trash out, you want me to cut your yard, you know, just let us know, you know, we'll be, you know, I want to help you. And she said, I thought that was so nice. And so when my friend asked me, how do I teach my kids? It bothered me so much because I told my son, I went to my son, I said, son, I didn't know that you went and said that. He was like, yeah, mom, I just felt bad. And I just wanted her to know that if she ever needed any help, you know, that I want to help her. And you know what I had to tell my son? I had to tell him, I said, son, I said, if you ever see any neighbor in distress, I said, don't touch him. I said, pick up the phone, get your phone, call 911, go run to a neighbor's house, come get mom and daddy. I said, you wait outside. He said, well, mama, what if they need some? I said, no, son. I said, number one, you're black. Number two, you're a boy. Number three, helps is what got your uncle convicted. I said, so therefore, I said, I have to tell you, I said, with a sad heart, I have to tell him how to put a cap or a requirement and a stipulation on when it comes down to him helping. And on that day that Bubba went in, Bubba, they said he was soliciting sex, wanting sex from Miss Christopher, and when she refused, he went crazy. Well, number one, he was waiting on his girlfriend, who was the apple of his eye. And he's not that person to impose himself. That's crazy. That's not even part of his character at all. But he was waiting on his girlfriend, so he had no mindset. He didn't even know them. He had no motive. And they say he was, Kelley, looking at a Playboy magazine, and we realized later it was a Jet magazine that had Eddie Murphy on the cover. And, you know, so that wasn't even the case of his character. And so he did what he thought to do. He did what he was taught to do, was to help. And unfortunately, his help turned into something ugly. And we've still been fighting that ugliness for the past 33 years. And so my mother did. She went down to the Millings Police Department and she told them, she said, if my son is on drugs, test him, because we know our children. I know right now, if somebody fixed a sandwich, if they leave crumbs, I know who it is. If they wipe the counter off and leave a smear, because they know I don't like smears on my counter. I see my countertop. I like to see the shine on my countertops. Okay. Okay. Just call me however, but I am kind of OCD about that. And I like to see the shine. I know who it is. And my boys always say, how do you know that was me? I know my boys. I know how you guys do. I know my boys. She knew her son, and she knew that there was just no way. We thought, as I was listening to a Clay Kane show on Sirius XM, and he had some exonerees on there, and Chester Hallman was one of the ones, the Innocence Project. It's on the Innocence Files. If you have not seen that on Netflix, I strongly encourage you to watch it. He said that his mother was telling the same thing my mother told us. She said, Pervis is going to be home by the end of the week. He's telling the truth. So they can't hold him if he's telling the truth. And Chester said, my mother said the same thing. She said, son, tell the truth and you'll be home. Just tell the truth. And he said, I didn't realize that that truth was going to cost me 28 years of my life. I said, that's my story. That's our story. I didn't realize, Bubba didn't realize that he told the truth, and his truth would cost him almost 34 years of his life. But I believe with all of my heart, as the word of God say, if you have heard me on a Zoom, you know I believe in the power of the word, that it says, and you shall know the truth. Not my truth or somebody else's truth, but this is the same truth. Every time I hear Sabrina, she say the same thing. If you notice, somebody tweeted, I mean, not tweeted, but chatted and said, Sabrina, I never get tired of hearing her. She say the same thing. For 33 years, Bubba has said the same thing. For 28 years, Chester said he said the same thing, told the truth. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. I'm going to stand on that. And I believe as long as there is breath in my brother's body, and there is breath in my body, and there is breath in Kelley's body, we believe that the truth will set him free. Thank you for this time.
Thank you, Rolanda. Stacy, if you would, after all of that, tell us what we need to do to take action.
Absolutely. Let me figure out what I'm doing here for a second. Y'all bear with me.
While Stacy's doing that,
Yeah, y'all keep going. If there are questions.
Yeah, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And after Stacy tells us what we can do to take action, we'll take some questions.
Well, Jonathan, go ahead and take some questions while I'm trying to figure my technical difficulties out here. I'll figure it out.
Here. Well, Sabrina, how about a question for you? During your years of incarceration, how did you keep yourself going?
Well, at first I was not a happy camper. I was really angry with God because I was trying to figure out why would he let something so harsh happen to me and my son? You know what I mean? So, and then I was young, I was 19. So, when I made it to death row. So after a while, I just got tired of crying and sitting on the floor and, feeling sorry for myself. So I started writing a journal and just, talking to God, just having a full out conversation. I guess they walked beside my door and they said, what's wrong with her? She lost her mind. But I mean, that was the only way, because when you're inside a cell, there's nothing but you and God. And you ain't got nothing but, time. And so you have to make choices. And my choice was to just continue to fight the best way I knew how. And that was to keep them from getting my mind, stealing my mind. They stole my body, they couldn't steal my mind.
Kelley, there was a question, I think, what are the next steps in Pervis Payne's case, given that all state avenues of relief have been effectively exhausted, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong there. I do civil work, I don't do criminal. What are the next steps for Pervis's case?
Given the legislation that passed this week, as soon as the governor signs the bill, we'll be filing a motion in Shelby County Criminal Court to have his death sentence declared unconstitutional. And it'll be up to the DA whether or not she will choose to contest that motion or she can join us. So we will be moving into our next phase of grassroots and community organizing to encourage DA Wyrick to join our request to have Pervis determined to be ineligible for execution because of his intellectual disability under the new law. At the same time, we will continue to press our request for executive clemency to Governor Lee to ask him to, commute Pervis's sentence because of all the questions surrounding his case, because he is an innocent man. We will not be satisfied until we bring Pervis home, and we will have to continue to exhaust our clemency avenues. And we continue to investigate. When I got on Pervis's case, pretty soon after, COVID hit, and I got COVID and was very sick. So we really didn't have the opportunity to conduct the investigation that we want. If we are able to uncover additional information, then that could provide an avenue to court. But right now, the focus is going to be on the intellectual disability motion and encouraging the DA to agree with our motion.
Stacy, we had a question real quick. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but for those who are serving a death sentence, they're on death row right now, what's the average age that they were on the date of conviction? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Kelley may know that better than I do. I would say they're generally, 20s. Kelley, I don't know what, it's generally younger folks.
Absolutely. It's the rare person who is over 30 who gets a capital sentence. Most of my clients were quite young at the time of their conviction, and particularly folks out of Memphis. For a long period of time, Memphis would file death notices on every single first-degree murder case. So we have a lot of young men who really, their cases should have been charged as less than first-degree murder, where the DA used the death penalty as a means of trying to force a plea, and those clients didn't take the pleas, and unfortunately, they paid the trial penalty of receiving a death sentence because they insisted on going to trial. So we have a lot of young men from Memphis, 18, 19 years old at the time.
There are some states that allow death sentences for juveniles, correct? Or at least had in the past. Is that?
Until 2005, in the case of Roper versus Simmons, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared that it was unconstitutional to execute anyone who was under 18, states did allow for people 16 and older. Some states actually allowed 14 and older to be sentenced to death, but that has not been allowed since 2005. And many of us believe that that should be raised to 25 because science tells us that the brain does not fully develop until a person is 25 years old.
John, yeah, I don't know what's going on with my share screen feature, but what I can do is just tell folks the most pertinent things to do to take action. I think y'all can figure this out without having to see it on my share screen. Obviously, we would love for people to get involved, to get on our email list so you know what's going on with this case and other cases and anything that's going on around the death penalty. TennesseeDeathPenalty.org. You can just sign up to get on the list. As Kelley mentioned, there is a petition on Innocence Project, PervisPayne.org. And that's probably been put in the chat somewhere, but if not, we can get it up there. PervisPayne.org. There's 700,000 some odd signatures now. The goal's 1 million. So if you're hearing this, you can go on there, sign it, share it widely with anybody and everybody. There's also on our website, TennesseeDeathPenalty.org, if you go to cases, you'll see Pervis is at the top there. He pops up. And if you read down, we've got a toolkit on there for social media. Social media is a great way, as we all know, to get the word out. And there's sample tweets, there's sample Facebook posts, Instagram, there's TikTok, there's all this stuff out there. We need people to be sharing about him on social media, talking to family, friends, church groups, book clubs, civic groups, whomever you know, and please share the story. And again, push people to go to visit pervispayne.org so that they can add their name to that growing list. We want to get that up to that million number. But those are the things that pop up. Kelley, Rolanda, anybody have anything to add? But those are the things that pop up as the most critical pieces.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's what we're asking everyone to do, is help us get to that million mark, talk about Pervis's case, say his name, as we say. There's a Facebook group as well, Friends of Pervis Payne, that folks can join. I think it's almost close to 1,000 members now. And follow me on Twitter, follow Rolanda on Twitter, and we'll try to post updates, retweet things that you see that from Stacy and others about the case and other things that are going on. We just really appreciate your support in this opportunity.
Stacy, we had one other question. You had mentioned that there had only been 2 death penalty sentences since 2013. Question is, do you all have statistics on how many death penalty eligible cases have been sentenced since 2013 where the death penalty wasn't used?
I don't. I saw that question and I do not have that information. Kelley may have more of that information. How many death sentences? I mean, how many, what's the word I'm looking for? Death notice.
Right.
Death notice cases there have been in that time period versus how many did get the death sentence. And I don't have the answer to that question. It's a great question.
It is a fantastic question. And I'm pretty sure that Ed Miller and his research probably has that information. I don't have it off the top of my head, but folks can look up a article called The Death Penalty Lottery that was written by attorney Ed Miller and attorney Brad McClain. Ed has been studying all of the Tennessee Supreme Court's Rule 13 reports, which in every first-degree murder case are supposed to be filled out, but they often are not. So Ed is a great resource on that, but I can't tell you that number. I'm sorry.
That's a great question. I'm going to try to find that out. I may look that up too, Kelley. So good question.
Rolanda, I guess one last question. I know we want to be good stewards of everyone's time, but in light of the legislation this week and everything that's going on, how is your brother holding up?
He's good. He's very excited about this opportunity, and not only for him, but he knows that it was going to change and be a great help for the others who are in a situation like him as well. So he is very grateful for this, very grateful, because as Kelley said, that's been something that has been working. We've been working on for a long time. Was his intellectual disability. So to finally get to this point, he's very happy and very grateful to the House and to the Senate, as my dad and I are, for the opportunity. And I think we all think it's a step in the right direction.
Good. Well, thank you, Stacy, Sabrina, Rhonda, Kelley. Thank you all for being here tonight and talking with us. Stacy, I guess, do you want to close us out?
Just again, thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody who's joined us. And you've got lots of good information in the chat here. So make sure you capture that. We will we have a recording of whether it's this particular one or an iteration of this event. We're going to get that on YouTube and get that out. If you get on our email list, you can access that, and hopefully we'll get it on our website here shortly too. So hopefully we can keep sharing this and keeping the word going. So thanks to everybody. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.